darkness. Not the darkness of a closed eye, the darkness of wood 6 inches from your face. You try to move your arm, it won't go far. You try to scream. The sound dies before it leaves your throat, swallowed by dirt, by silence, by a lid someone nailed shut this morning. Somewhere above you, people are walking home, having dinner, going to sleep. They think you are already gone. For most of human history, they might have been wrong. This is curse cycle. Today, the fear that haunted an entire century. The buildings built to contain it, the inventions born from it, and the true story behind a phrase you've used your whole life, without knowing where it came from. They called it taphophobia, from the Greek word for grave and the word for fear. The term wasn't coined until 1891 by an Italian psychiatrist named Enrico Morselli, but the fear itself was already a century old by then, an obsession that had quietly shaped the way an entire civilization buried its dead. It wasn't superstition. It wasn't folklore whispered by old women at funerals. It was a fear built on medicine that simply couldn't tell the difference between deep sleep and death. So how do you prove someone is truly dead when your only tools are a mirror and a guess? Physicians tried everything. A hot poker pressed to sensitive areas of the body, waiting for a reaction that never came. Warm urine poured into the mouth, hoping to trigger a swallow. A physician's own finger pushed into the corpse's ear, listening for the faint hum of a pulse only he could feel. None of it was reliable. All of it was desperate. It wasn't until 1846 that a French physician named Eugène Bouchut proposed something almost embarrassingly simple. Use a stethoscope. Listen for a heartbeat. If there is none, for long enough, that is death. It took society decades to trust an instrument over a guess, and in the meantime, some families invented their own final test. They would paint invisible words on the glass above a coffin, using silver nitrate, a chemical that only reveals itself when it reacts with the gases of decomposition. If the glass ever spelled out 2 words, "I am dead," only then would they allow the burial to proceed. In the 19th century, the fear reached its peak for a very specific reason: cholera. The disease spread through contact, through fear, through panic. And when panic runs a city, it doesn't wait. Families terrified of contagion buried their dead within hours, sometimes without a doctor ever confirming the person was truly gone. The numbers that survive from that era are hard to read without a chill. One 1895 study estimated that at least 2,700 people, every single year, were mistakenly buried alive in England and Wales alone. In France, one physician calculated the number differently, but arrived somewhere just as dark: 4 people, every day, lowered into the ground while their hearts were still beating. This wasn't a ghost story. This was a statistic. Sometimes the fear stopped being theoretical. Records from the period describe bodies exhumed for reburial, routine, unremarkable work that turned into something else entirely. One account describes a coffin opened months after burial. The body inside was no longer lying peacefully as it had been left. It had turned, fully turned, inside a space barely wider than its own shoulders. The burial shroud was torn, the hair disturbed, tangled, pulled. Whoever recorded that scene did not write it as fiction. They wrote it as a report. And reports like it, quiet, clinical, and utterly horrifying, are the reason an entire industry was about to be born. This wasn't a fear reserved for the poor or the uneducated or the superstitious. Composer Frédéric Chopin was so afraid of premature burial that he requested his body be cut open after death, just to be certain. Author Hans Christian Andersen, a man who spent his life writing about wonder and imagination, left instructions that his arteries be slashed before burial. And in America, George Washington, the first president of the United States, asked that his body be watched for 2 full days before anyone was permitted to close the coffin. If the most powerful, most celebrated people of their era didn't trust death, what chance did anyone else have? If medicine couldn't guarantee death, engineering would try to guarantee escape. The first known safety coffin was built in 1790, commissioned by Duke Ferdinand of Brunswick. It was a simple idea: a window in the lid to let in light, a tube to let in air. It wasn't much, but it was the first time in recorded history that a coffin was built not to contain the dead, but to give the living, not yet dead, a fighting chance. It would not be the last. Decades later, a German physician named Johann Gottfried Taberger refined the idea into something far more elaborate and far more desperate. His design connected ropes to the hands, feet, and head of the corpse. Every rope led upward, out of the earth, to a single point, a bell mounted above the grave. The theory was simple. If you woke up in that coffin, if you so much as twitched, the bell would ring, and someone, somewhere above, would come running. In practice, it rarely worked the way anyone hoped. In 1822, a German doctor named Adolf Gutsmuth decided the only way to prove his coffin design worked was to test it on himself. He had himself sealed inside his own invention and lowered into the ground. For several hours, he remained there, buried alive by choice, breathing through his tube and, according to the record, eating a full meal of soup, sausages, and beer, delivered through a feeding tube built into the lid. He survived, completely unscathed. Proof, he claimed, that the fear could be conquered by design. Whether that made the fear any less terrifying for everyone else is a different question entirely. Not every design was so reassuring. An American inventor named Franz Vester built his own version, cords tied to the body connected to a bell and a flag above ground, so a corpse could be spotted even in daylight. But there was a flaw no one wanted to talk about. As bodies decompose, they shift, they settle, they move, on their own, with no one alive inside them at all. Which meant, more than once, a bell rang above a fresh grave, and the person who ran to dig, who tore through the earth with their bare hands, hoping to save a life, found only a corpse, and a rope that had simply slipped. By 1897, a Russian count named Michel de Karnitze-Karnicki patented what many consider the most advanced safety coffin ever built. The slightest movement of the chest would trigger a spring mechanism, raising a flag 4 feet above the grave and lighting a lamp automatically, without the buried person needing to move a muscle more than once. It was, by every measure, an engineering triumph. It was also, by then, already too late to matter. While the rest of the world buried its fear underground, Germany built an entire institution around it, above ground, in plain sight. They were called Leichenhäuser, waiting mortuaries. The first opened in 1791, in Weimar, built by a physician named Christoph Wilhelm Hufeland. It could hold 8 bodies at once, kept warm by steam pipes, not to comfort the dead, but to speed up decomposition, because decomposition was the only sign of death nobody could argue with. The idea spread. Ansbach, Munich, Frankfurt, Berlin, grand buildings with marble columns rivaling churches. Inside, bodies were laid on zinc trays surrounded by fresh flowers, flowers that, historians believe, are the real reason we still bring flowers to funerals today. Not for beauty, to mask the smell. And around every finger, every toe, a string, each one leading to a bell. Caretakers watched over these halls, day and night, for decades, waiting for a bell to ring. Here is the part almost no one tells you. Across the entire 19th century, through every waiting mortuary Germany ever built, through every string, every bell, every caretaker's sleepless night, not one single bell ever rang from someone who had actually come back to life? 0. Researchers who later combed through the records confirmed it. The doctors of that era, for all their crude tools and desperate tests, had been right about death far more often than anyone gave them credit for. By the 1890s, Germany quietly removed the alarm systems from its mortuaries. They simply weren't needed. An entire century, an entire industry built on bells, flags, springs, and steam-heated halls, built to catch a moment that, as far as the record shows, never once happened. Which brings us to something you've probably said yourself, without ever knowing its supposed origin: saved by the bell. For decades, people have connected that phrase to exactly what you just heard: a coffin bell, ringing to save someone from the grave. It's a perfect story. It makes sense. It feels true. It's also completely false. The phrase actually comes from boxing. A fighter, moments from defeat, rescued by the bell marking the end of the round. Nothing to do with graves, nothing to do with coffins, but the myth survived anyway. Because the truth about premature burial was so widespread, so real, so documented, that people didn't need a phrase to invent the fear. They already had 2,700 reasons a year to believe it. Even if, in Germany's grandest halls built to catch it, the bell never once had a reason to ring. The fear didn't stay confined to coffins and cemeteries. It crawled into literature and never left. In 1844, Edgar Allan Poe published The Premature Burial, a story that turned this exact terror into one of the most unsettling pieces of Gothic fiction ever written. Decades earlier, in 1818, Mary Shelley had already touched the same nerve from a different angle. Frankenstein wasn't just a story about creating life. It was a story born from a century obsessed with the blurry, uncertain line between death and whatever comes just before it. The 19th century didn't just fear premature burial, it built its nightmares out of it. Back to that coffin, that sliver of light, that hand reaching. Medicine has changed since then. We no longer bury people within hours of a fever. We no longer guess where life ends and death begins. But the fear Duke Ferdinand tried to engineer his way out of in 1790, the fear that filled marble halls with strings and bells that never rang, it never actually needed a coffin to survive. It just needed a moment of silence, a held breath, a question you can't quite answer. Are you sure they were really gone? This has been Curse Cycle. If this pulled you in, subscribe. The next story is already waiting.